Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's video is inspired by an email that I received from a subscriber, Tom Arliskus, who was very pleased with the coverage that I've done of the Western theater, both on these videos and in Military Images Magazine. Tom said, by the way, for you Eastern theater people, the Civil War was won in the West. Well, to celebrate Tom and thank him for that email, I'm going to share a story about Shiloh, where on April 6th, 1862, the shock of a sudden attack by Confederates caught Federal forces off guard and fully unprepared. Such was the case for Union General William H.L. Wallace and his division. They prepared for morning inspection completely unprepared and unknowing that fighting at Shiloh was well underway. Before long, as they were prepping for the day, a rumor circulated through the ranks that skirmishers were active in their front. One of those regiments in camp that morning was the 12th Iowa Infantry, and there the men reacted to the news with, well, mixed emotions. Some shrugged it off and continued their morning routine in the fields and woods about their encampment. Others took advantage of the balmy weather to bathe in a nearby stream. In Company B, Second Lieutenant John Herman Borger, he's pictured here, went about his duties. A Hessian immigrant in his early 20s, he had more military experience than most of the boys in his command. One day back in 1855, soon after he had come to America, he walked into the Brooklyn Navy Yard as an immigrant and walked out as a Marine. Borger proved a very good Marine, assigned to the 32-man detachment of Marines aboard the frigate San Jacinto. He and his comrades steamed to China to defend Americans threatened by a war between Anglo-French forces and the Chinese Qing dynasty. What began as a diplomatic mission ended in bloodshed when Marines and sailors faced enemy fire after they landed along the Pearl River in Guangzhou. It was in 1856. The Americans scored a victory in what became known as the Battle of the Barrier Forts. Just 3 years later, Borger mustered out of the Marines as a corporal, perhaps inspired by wanderlust during his stint as a Marine. He headed to the Midwest and started a new life in Iowa. Then the war came and it interrupted his plans. He said, I saw that my country needed me. My services were offered again the second time, freely and voluntarily. This is what Borger later said. He enlisted in the 12th in the autumn of 1861. The men voted for officers, a common practice among volunteer regiments on both sides of the conflict, and elected Borger second lieutenant. Borger and the rest of the 12th trained at Benton Barracks in St. Louis. In early 1862, the regiment joined Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant's forces in Kentucky. The Iowans participated in Grant's campaign against Forts Henry and Donelson and saw their first hostile fire during the capture of Donelson on February 15th, 1862. 2 months later at Shiloh, the 12th and three other Iowa regiments, the 2nd, 7th, and 14th, formed the Iowa Brigade. Colonel James M. Tuttle of the 2nd commanded the brigade. A respected war Democrat, he reported to Brigadier General Wallace. A rumor about camp skirmishers, Confederate skirmishers about camp that had spread in the early morning of the 6th, turned out to be true. Confirmation came in the form of rapid charges of artillery fire. Before long, even the skeptics in camp realized that something big and violent was headed their way. Major David W. Reed, who wrote the regimental history of the 12th Iowa, observed, quote, the men had received these convincing impressions, as it were, by intuition, and had hurried to camp from various excursions upon which they had gone, and nearly all had their guns in their hands and cartridge boxes on. When the long roll was sounded on the regimental parade ground, and within a very few moments thereafter, the whole regiment was in line and soon joined the balance of the brigade as all hurried rapidly to the front. The Iowa Brigade, with Colonel Tuttle in command, hustled down the eastern Corinth Road and happened upon an open field. The alert colonel spotted Confederates in the woods on the opposite side. Tuttle moved fast. He immediately formed his Iowans in a solid blue line on high ground along a fence that bordered an old sunken road. The 14th occupied a wooded area on the extreme left. Borger and the 12th lined up to its right. 3 companies of the 12th took up a position in the timbers, and the remainder faced an open field. To the right of the 12th formed the 7th and the 2nd Iowa Infantries. As the men scrambled to erect makeshift defenses with whatever they could find, a pair of artillery batteries wheeled into position to support them. Wallace followed close on Tuttle's heels with the rest of the division, but before Wallace could bring the men into position, a trio of Confederate brigades descended upon Tuttle's lone Iowa brigade. The gray troops coming at them were impressed by the sight of the Iowans. William P. Johnston described the view in the biography of his father, General Albert Sidney Johnston, who suffered a mortal wound during the battle. William P. Johnston said, quote, "Here, behind a dense thicket on the crest of a hill, was posted a strong force of as hardy troops as ever fought, almost perfectly protected by the conformation of the ground and by logs and other rude and hastily prepared defenses. To assail it, an open field had to be passed, enfiladed by the fire of its batteries." Alabamians, commanded by Colonel Daniel W. Adams, moved in on Tuttle's left flank for the kill. They advanced with great confidence to the timber upon the 12th and 14th Iowa until they were within just a few paces of our line, reported historian Reed, when they encountered such a blaze of fire from the sunken road that they faltered, then fell back to the shelter of a ravine. The Iowans pursued the retreating Alabamians and ran smack into a brigade of Louisiana troops who suffered the same fate as the Alabama boys. The Iowans, meanwhile, fell back to the relative safety of their original position. Meanwhile, on Tuttle's right flank, a brigade of Arkansas soldiers attacked the 7th and the 2nd. They suffered the same fate as the Alabamians and the Louisianans. Confederate commanders believed the position could be taken and ordered their troops to attack again and again. Historian Reed counted 12 separate charges during the day. He wrote, "The 12th, located at the very center of the contested line, had participated in repelling every attack, whether it came through the timber or across the open field." End quote. Reed continued describing the scene. Quote, "The field in front was so thickly strewn with dead that it could have been walked over without stepping off a dead body. Yet there was not a man who had left the regimental ranks except as he had been carried away wounded. Cartridges had been supplied from time to time as needed, and at 5 o'clock p.m. that line, the key to the position, was as firmly held as 10 o'clock in the morning, and the men of the regiment were as capable as resisting as many more attacks if they came from the front as they had been to resist those that had been repeatedly made upon them." End quote. Somehow, Borger numbered among the fortunate survivors who escaped the carnage and chaos and outlasted the enemy through 6 brutal hours of combat. Johnston summed up the Confederate experience when he wrote, quote, "No figure of speech would be too strong to express the deadly peril of assault upon this natural fortress, whose inaccessible barriers blazed for 6 hours with sheets of flame and whose infernal gates poured forth a murderous storm of shot and shell and musket fire, which no living thing could quell or even withstand. Brigade after brigade was led against it, but valor was of no avail. End quote. Rebels nicknamed this area the Hornet's Nest. Tuttle's Iowa Brigade became known as the Hornet's Nest Brigade for its stubborn defense of this position. The Yankees did not have the same success on other sectors of the battlefield. Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant's army faced annihilation, and its commander scrambled to establish a defensive perimeter near Pittsburgh Landing along the Tennessee River. Wallace ordered his troops to withdraw after federal forces on either side of his division pulled out. He suffered a mortal wound shortly after he issued the command. One of Wallace's aides delivered the withdrawal order to Tuttle. He led the 2nd and 7th regiments out and dispatched a messenger to relay the order to the 12th and the 14th. That messenger and his order never made it. Unaware of the fury about to fall upon them, Borger and his comrades continued to fight alongside their West Point educated colonel, Joseph J. Woods. At some point during this critical period, ominous indicators surfaced. Some of the Iowans detected shifting sounds of battle moving behind them. Others observed Union troops falling back on their left and right, but the majority were too occupied with the Confederates in front of them to pay serious attention to the warning signs. Quote, it was only when they heard Colonel Woods' order ring out as coolly as if on parade, 12th Iowa, about face, forward march, that they appreciated the real danger that threatened their very existence. End quote. Borger and the rest of the regiment turned and headed for the rear. They only marched a short distance when they happened upon a formidable enemy line blocking the way. Here, they realized that the Confederates had surrounded their position. Undaunted, the Iowans leveled their muskets and blasted away at the foemen that blocked their path. Colonel Tuttle, now on the other side with his 2 other regiments, heard the firing and recognized it for what it was, a breakout attempt. He hastily organized a rescue mission, but before he got there, the firing had ceased, and he knew that the 12th and 14th were lost. The Confederates consumed the better part of an hour cleaning out the nest after the larger body of Federals withdrew to Pittsburgh Landing. Some would later make the case that the stubborn resistance by the Iowans prevented Grant's army from total destruction. Historian Reed noted, quote, as the sun was setting on the army they had saved, these gallant men threw down their arms and surrendered themselves as prisoners of war, end quote. While Grant's forces took advantage of precious minutes to strengthen their new position, Borger and 381 of his fellow Iowans in the 12th began their ordeal as prisoners of war. They traveled by foot and rail to Mobile, Alabama, where the men were separated. Captains and officers higher in rank were imprisoned in Selma. Borger and other lieutenants were sent with the rank and file to various prison camps scattered across the state. Back in Iowa, families and friends struggled with their emotions. According to the April 18th, 1862 edition of the Cedar Falls Gazette, quote, we have been passing tedious and anxious days, longing for news from our own brave sons, and at last we have commenced to get meager reports of the important part they played in that sanguinary conflict. Almost the first report we hear from them is the Iowa troops fought like tigers, end quote. The home folks might have known that their sons, husbands, and fathers faced the privations of prison life with the same courage exhibited while they were in the Hornet's Nest. Pushed beyond the brink of endurance in Southern camps, about 80 men, roughly a quarter of those captured, died in captivity. One of the soldiers in the 12th, David B. Henderson of Company C, stated after the war that they, quote, went to rot and die in the prison hells of the South, end quote. Borger himself noted that his captors, quote, threw us down in the southern hell, end quote. He managed to survive the horrors of prison life. After a few months in Alabama, he and the other lieutenants were sent to a prison camp in Madison, Georgia, where they reunited with the officers captured at Shiloh. Borger gained his release in October 1862 after 6 long months in captivity. He returned to the 12th with a promotion to first lieutenant. In the summer of 1864, he suffered a bout of sunstroke that left him sightless in his right eye and suffering chronic headaches. Still, he remained with the regiment until it mustered out of the service when his 3-year term of enlistment expired in the fall of 1864. By now, his health was compromised. Still, he kept on. Borger settled in the Chicago suburb of Addison and made another go at life. He married a German immigrant, a fellow German immigrant named Louise, and went to work as a mail carrier. The physical demands of the job proved too much, however, and he stopped working. He applied for a pension in 1880, but died before the government approved it. Doctors declared consumption contracted during his army service as the cause of his death at about age 44. Louise and a 17-month-old daughter, Elfriede, survived him. Louise eventually received a widow's pension, her husband's benefits from the war. In the spring of 1882, a year after Borger died, survivors of the regiment held their second reunion. One of its number paid tribute to those who had passed. He said, quote, time, with ruthless hand, has made sad inroads in our ranks, and many an anxious inquirer after some old friend is met today with the crushing reply, dead. We hope that there are many parades in store for our association, but our own good sense tells us that the time is not far distant when the last remaining member of our regiment must answer to the call of lights out. Then let us hope that when our reveille is beaten in camp and the great hereafter, that we may meet with hearts true and loyal as they were when we went forth to fight our country's battles. End quote. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.